Joseph Edward Abercrombie has released 13 novels and 2 short story collections. And I have read them all. I have conquered this man's bibliography. And if you follow the channel, you know I hate this man. That's what I say after I finish some of his books, but in reality, I think he is a fantastic author and one of my favorites of all time. And since it looks like it'll be over a year before we have anything new from him, I thought the best way to send him off on the channel would be to take a look at all of his books and see how they all hold up against each other. Now, normally when I do ranking videos, I'll do them on a tier list, but I didn't actually think that would be the best format for this video, because where I think most Abercrombie books are so amazing, it would really be a stupid looking tier list without much variety. So my friends, we're just gonna do it the old-fashioned way. As is obvious, you know, this is my list, my rankings, you know, the objective truth. If you don't agree, you're wrong, all that stuff. Oh, also, no spoilers ahead. This is just all general synopsis stuff, so even if you've never read an Abercrombie book, you can still check it out.
United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru.
Now, it was not really hard for me to pick Half the World as my least favorite Joe Abercrombie book. This is the second book in his Shattered Seas trilogy, and it's one that, out of all of his books, was probably the least enjoyable for me. Not to say this was a bad book, I don't think Abercrombie has ever written a bad book, but it was just a little weird for me as a sequel to Half a King. You know, it jumps ahead many years later, it replaces the interesting main character of the first book with Thorn, who really didn't care for. I think as, you know, young adult fantasy books go, the writing quality in these ones is far above the standard, but I still think it kind of fell into the pitfalls of those books. You know, so much of this book is focused on what I felt to be a pretty forced romance, and just not being able to connect with the main character really brought this one down for me. Next up is Half a War, a book I enjoyed marginally more than Half the World. Partially because we once again replaced the main character. Here we're following Princess Skara, who I do think is a much better character than Thorn was. But you see, I think the issue with this book is the conclusion to the Shattered Seas, is that it really kind of showed off what I felt was the missed potential of the story. This was a really cool world with very ambitious storytelling for a young adult series, but it is just so short, and I think Abercrombie works a lot better when he has a lot of time to build stuff up. And as a result, there's just so many characters and plot points stuffed into here that never really has the impact that I wanted it to have. I can still say overall this is a decent YA trilogy, but it's just really not at the level for his adult books. But I am an adult, so I guess it makes sense that I would think that. Next up, the first of many First Law books we'll be talking about, Sharpens. This is a collection of many short stories that span from before the Blade itself to around Red Country era First Law. They take us all around the world following different characters, some new ones, some that we're very familiar with, and it gives us just some fun little adventures that take place in this world. And I think overall it is a pretty enjoyable collection. Though like I was saying with Shattered Sea, I think Abercrombie's strength really comes from when he has a lot more time to just set stuff up and pay things off, and you don't really get that with these short stories, and none of them really stood out to me as being amazing or must-reads. It was cool spending time with some fan favorites again, but like nothing I thought really added much to the story we already knew. Definitely worth reading if you are a completionist, but I also don't think it is super necessary. And here we have Half a King. This is the first book in the Shattered Seas trilogy, and obviously my favorite. I think this is a really solid little story, and it's because it plays to the strengths of this medium, that being a rather short young adult novel. It's a coming-age story about Yarvi, a prince who is betrayed by his family, and then he has to sort of go on a revenge quest, but he faces a lot of challenges because he is disabled and has to rely on his wits. It's not a super unique story, but it is told in a very compelling way. And it kind of works pretty well as a standalone too. So even if the rest of this trilogy doesn't really sound appealing to you, I would still probably give this one a try, especially if you're an Abercrombie fan. It is a nifty little one for sure, and as I was saying, you know, the writing quality far better than most stuff teenagers are reading.
Oh, the times they are are a-changing.
Next, we have another short story collection, The Great Change. This is a collection of stories that take place during the Age of Madness era of the First Law, and I actually think this set of stories are quite a bit stronger than what's found in Sharpens, as they all directly tie into the Age of Madness trilogy to reinforce its themes, and it also gives us a lot of behind-the-scenes insight to certain characters. It had more of a low-key release, so like there's a lot of people who probably don't even know about this thing, but it is a very strong companion to the Age of Madness, and I would highly recommend it to fans, especially because it'll probably be a while before we get more First Law stuff.
Fire is the devil's only friend.
And now we shift our focus to the new kid on the block, The Devils. Fun fact, after I recently reviewed this book, I got contacted by my old friend James Cameron, and he was like, bro, I loved your video so much, the book sounds so cool, that I bought the goddamn rights to it. I'm like, okay, James, can I get a cut of that, since you know I helped? He's like, no. And then he hung up on me. Anyway, yes, this is Abercrombie's brand new book in a brand new series. Historical fantasy, takes place in Europe. We're following this ragtag group of misfits and magical creatures as they journey across a medieval Europe. It's so entertaining, so funny, a ton of awesome action. Definitely a bit less serious than most of Joe's other books, but I just think it works super, super well. And it really set the stages for what I think will end up a fantastic series. And of course, jokes aside, you know, the news of James Cameron working on an adaptation of Joe Abercrombie, that's literally too good to be true. And for that reason, I really hope it doesn't fall apart. The only negative I really had about this book was I didn't really care for the villains that much. They all felt a bit one note to me, which seemed a bit out of character for Abercrombie, but there are places to take it in the future, and yeah, cannot wait for more.
Country roads.
Red Country is the first of the First Law standalones. I do not consider the standalones to actually be standalones, and I really dislike how they are classified as that. Because yes, while the overall plot may be confined to just the one book, they still have overarching character arcs, deal with the heavy consequences of the first trilogy, and set up so much for the Age of Madness. I cannot stress how important it is to read these books in publication order. Be a mini rant out of the way, Red Country is a pretty interesting book in the canon of the First Law, as it's a bit of a departure from everything the series had been doing. We're set in the far country, in like the far reaches of the world we hadn't really explored up to this point, and it gives the vibes of like an action-packed western adventure story, as we follow this young woman Shy across the treacherous landscape as she searches for her kidnapped siblings, accompanied by her grumpy old stepdad. Really entertaining and engaging stuff, some awesome character work in here, for characters both new and old. I think out of all the proper First Law novels, the only reason it kind of ranks as the lowest, it doesn't really have some of the stuff I feel to be the most entertaining out of the First Law. The grand scale, the political scheming, the social unrest, like none of that's really in this one, but I think that's okay, because it tried to be something different, and it ended up being a really good time.
Show me the place where he inserted the blade.
The one that started it all. The Blade itself. I find it very fitting that there is a quote here from George R.R. Martin, because it really does set the stage for a story that's of similar quality to A Song of Ice and Fire, and to be quite frankly, because, you know, it contains endings, maybe a little better. Yes, Joe Abercrombie's first published novel, and holy moly, what a debut. The world he introduces you to here is brutal, it's instantly engaging, and the characters are absolute all-timers. Even when they're first introduced, before they go through a ton of development, they are all instantly iconic, so much fun to follow. The books are just filled with such an entertaining, dry wit. The way he builds out the politics and the magic of this world, it's all, it's so good. But you see, while The Blade itself excels in all of those areas, it doesn't really have a lot of plot. And I think that's fine, because, you know, this was meant to be a setup book, to get us interested in what the First Law has to offer. But, you know, the other books just have a ton of action and big payoffs and stuff, you know, thanks in part to The Blade itself. But I just think on its own, it's not quite at the level of some of those other books, but it is still very fantastic in its own right. And Abercrombie would not be where he is today without it. I know we're only halfway through, but everything after this point is a 5-star read. I love them all to death, and it was very hard to rank them, but I think I figured it out.
I wanna be a hero.
Yes, the first of the goated books is The Heroes, another standalone book that takes place between the two trilogies, and it's very unique in that the whole thing takes place over the span of 3 days during a very divisive battle at the end of a big war. A war set off because of events in the previous trilogy. This is why I think you need to read them all in order. But yeah, we're essentially just following a bunch of different characters on different sides of this war. We're jumping all around with the POVs. We're getting to see a ton of battles play out, and easily the most action-packed of the series. And man, Joe writes the best action scenes. They're so awesome. Despite it only covering a short period of time, it is super well paced. The characters go through so much development. They're so fun to follow, and it really shows you how much variety Abercrombie can have as an author if he decides to experiment a bit. And if he does give us more standalone First Law books, it would be really cool to see if he does more interesting things like he does in The Heroes. The laws are changing. Oh, indeed they are. This is A Little Hatred, the beginning of a new chapter in the First Law universe. And boy, does it hit the ground running. This was the first novel Joe put out after the Shattered Seas trilogy, and for as mixed as I am about that series, I do think that it seems to have taught Joe a very valuable skill, and that involves pacing. I would call the original First Law trilogy definitely a slow burn. The Age of Madness absolutely is not. These things move at breakneck pace. So many insane and crazy things are constantly happening. But unlike Shattered Sea, this book does not lose any of the First Law magic. It still has such incredible, rich characters, and the way he expands this world as it goes through this industrial revolution is so fascinating and so smart. It's great to see all of our fan favorites from the previous books, but he really does the impossible here and introduce a new main cast that's just as good as the old one. And I still have aftershocks from the tremors that the ending of this one gave me, so yeah. Before They Are Hanged is the second book in the original trilogy, and this one really shows off just how skilled Abercrombie is as a character writer, as most of this book follows our main cast as they are out of their element, going on a journey, which works to not only build the characters, but the world as well. This one does have more action, a lot more twists and turns in the plot, but again, it's really the characters where he shines in Before They Are Hanged. This is the book where all of the characters become god tier status. And as far as a middle book goes, the point between the setup of the first book and the big payoff of the third, you really can't get much better than Before They Are Hanged. Well, one book can get better than that, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Take your revenge!
Now, out of the standalone books, I will concede that Best Served Cold probably matches that description the most. Yes, this is a book where stuff that happens in the other ones is still relevant, but I actually think Joe avoids spoiling the original trilogy in this book in a very smart way. So I do think technically, yes, you could read this book without knowing anything else. You still probably shouldn't, but it makes sense to me why, this is the first one that seems up to be adapted. It's a very accessible story. And it is a revenge story about Monza Mercado as she travels across the First Law world to take down everyone who was responsible for the death of her brother. She gets the gang back together, a sleazy group of degenerates, all of whom have their quirks, none of whom can be trusted, and we follow this group as they take out Monza's targets one by one. Monza's story is incredibly engaging. The book does sort of follow this structure, but it is constantly surprising you with the directions the story takes. And it for sure has some of the best twists in all of the First Law. A very, very strong book that encapsulates everything I love about Abercrombie. But the trouble with that is that there's still 3 books I think are better than it. The Trouble with Peace is the second book of the Age of Madness trilogy. It takes the already insane story of A Little Hatred and really dials it up to 11. This book is stunning. It is insane. The directions it takes the characters are so unexpected and so wild. It is, again, as fast-paced as ever, full of action. It's full of just so many incredible reveals. Multiple times when I was reading this, I'm just genuinely, how is this a real novel that someone wrote? But again, we are still not at the peak. And up until recently, I believe that this book was the peak.
We're not enemies, we just disagree.
Yes, for the longest time, I did not think it got much better than The Last Argument of Kings, a book that still stands as one of the finest pieces of fantasy I have ever read. This is the culmination of the original First Law trilogy, and wow, if you thought there wasn't much plot going on up to this point, oh boy, you're in for a treat, as Joe expertly reveals that he knew what he was doing the whole time, and this is a juicy, thick book of nothing but payoff. Right from the beginning, it is whacking you over the face with giant revelations that change everything you knew about the story, while providing some of the most intense and engaging action of the story, and of course bringing our character arcs to a fittingly bittersweet end. This is truly a masterpiece of grimdark fantasy, and as much as I love Abercrombie, I really did not expect him to ever top it. It's been about 5 months since I have finished The Wisdom of Crowds, and guys, how did this happen? Genuinely, what the this thing, man. This thing. Take everything I said about Last Argument, the action, the story, the characters. It's all here. It is all so immaculate. The themes of this trilogy become so fully realized by the end. It is such a brutally brilliant, bittersweet piece of fiction, and it is truly like one of the top 3 books I've read in my life. I think about it every single day. I still cannot believe what Joe has put me through, and the fact that he ends it on a cliffhanger! We're not getting another First Law book till like 2030, folks. This is what we're left with, and I am devastated, but also very, very grateful that this book exists, because it is truly the peak zenith of all fiction. So that'll do it. That was my ranking for every Joe Abercrombie book. I gotta learn how to be more brief when I do the Brandon Sanderson one, Jesus. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Leave your thoughts on anything Abercrombie related in the comments down below. It'd be really cool if you guys left your rankings as well. Now we'll see you next time. We are actually doing the Discworld video next.